She called the police to force me back into the HOA. But the moment the officer stepped out of the car, she froze because he was my son. I never thought leaving the HOA would turn into one of the most stressful decisions of my life. But after years of constant pressure, I knew I had reached my breaking point. When I first bought my home, the HOA seemed harmless enough. They promised clean streets, higher property values, and a peaceful community. At the time, it sounded reasonable. I followed the rules, paid the fees on time, and stayed out of trouble. But slowly, things began to change. The rules multiplied. The fines became more frequent, and the tone shifted from community care to outright control. It started with small things. A warning letter because my trash bin was visible for an extra hour. A notice about my lawn being half an inch too long. Then came the fines, $50 here, $100 there, always justified with vague rule references. Every interaction felt hostile, especially from one particular HOA board member who clearly enjoyed flexing her authority. She watched my house like a hawk, waiting for any excuse to write me up. Neighbors whispered about her behavior, but no one wanted to confront her. People were afraid of retaliation. I tried to be patient. I attended meetings, raised concerns calmly, and asked for clarification on rules that seemed arbitrary. Each time, I was talked over, dismissed, or treated like a problem resident. The HOA wasn't about fairness anymore. It was about power. What pushed me over the edge was when I received a violation notice for a non-approved exterior modification. That didn't even exist. When I asked for proof, I was told, "We'll decide what counts." That was the moment I realized this would never end unless I took action. I spent weeks researching. I read bylaws, state laws, and property records. I contacted a real estate attorney and confirmed something important. My property was eligible to legally leave the HOA due to how the land had been subdivided years ago. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was completely lawful. Once I had everything documented and filed correctly, I notified the HOA in writing that I was formally withdrawing. No drama, no insults, just facts and paperwork. I expected pushback, but I didn't expect what came next. Almost immediately, the harassment intensified. Letters arrived claiming I was confused or misinformed. They warned me of consequences that didn't exist. I stayed calm and kept copies of everything. I knew my rights, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of relief. I thought that once they realized I was serious and legally protected, they'd back off. I was wrong. One person, in particular, couldn't accept losing control. And that decision to leave the HOA set off a chain of events that would soon pull the police into something that should have ended quietly. What began as a simple attempt to protect my home and my peace was about to turn into a confrontation no one saw coming. The moment HOA Karen realized she could no longer intimidate me with letters and fake warnings, her behavior shifted from passive-aggressive to openly hostile. At first, it was non-stop emails filled with legal-sounding language meant to scare me. She claimed my withdrawal was invalid, insisted I was still bound by HOA rules, and threatened massive fines if I didn't comply immediately. Every message carried the same tone: condescending, angry, and desperate to reassert control. I replied only once, attaching the legal documentation and stating clearly that all future communication should go through my attorney. That only made things worse. She began showing up in person. I'd catch her parked across the street, sitting in her car, staring at my house. Sometimes she'd walk up and down the sidewalk, phone in hand, clearly taking pictures. Once, she knocked on my door and loudly announced that I was violating community standards, hoping neighbors would hear. I didn't open the door. I documented everything. The more calm and silent I remained, the more unhinged she became. It was obvious she wasn't trying to resolve anything, she wanted a reaction. Then came the public confrontation. One afternoon, as I was pulling into my driveway, she stepped in front of my car and demanded I stop. She started yelling about unpaid dues and illegal separation from the HOA. Neighbors slowed down, watching from their porches. She spoke like she was some kind of authority figure, declaring that she would Make an example out of me so others wouldn't get ideas. That S when I realized this was no longer about rules. It was personal. Her threats escalated fast. She warned me that if I didn't reverse my decision, she would involve law enforcement. I actually laughed, thinking she was bluffing. What exactly was she going to tell them? That I left an HOA legally. But Karen was convinced that police uniforms would do what her threats couldn't. She believed authority only mattered when it wore a badge, and she fully expected that badge to be on her side. The call happened the next morning. I was inside when I heard the sirens outside the neighborhood, not rushing, but deliberate. Karen was standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, phone in hand, watching my house like she D1. Later, I found out she told dispatch that I was trespassing on HOA-controlled property, refusing to comply with lawful orders, and causing a disturbance. None of it was true, but she said it with confidence, the kind that comes from someone who has never been challenged before. She didn't expect facts to matter. She expected fear to work. As she waited for the police to arrive, she rehearsed her story, adjusting details, preparing to play the victim. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that this call was about to backfire in a way that would strip her of every ounce of authority she thought she had. When the police cruiser finally pulled into the neighborhood, Karen's posture changed instantly. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and walked toward the officer with the confidence of someone who believed this moment had been carefully engineered in her favor. Before the officer could even step fully out of the car, she launched into her story. Her voice was loud, dramatic, and designed to attract an audience. Neighbors stepped outside, pretending to check their mail or water plants, but clearly watching everything unfold. She explained that I was a non-compliant resident who had illegally withdrawn from the HOA and was now refusing to follow community rules. She waved printed papers in the air, pointing at highlighted sections like they were criminal charges. Every sentence she spoke painted herself as the responsible enforcer and me as a troublemaker who needed to be put in my place. She even suggested that my presence was lowering property values and disturbing the peace. The officer listened quietly, expression neutral, asking her to slow down and explain one point at a time. When it was my turn to speak, I stayed calm. I handed over my documents, property records, legal confirmation of my withdrawal, and copies of the letters I had already sent the HOA. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. That seemed to frustrate Karen more than anything else. She interrupted repeatedly, correcting me, rolling her eyes, and insisting that the officer already knew how HOAs work. Each interruption earned her a firmer warning from the officer to let me finish. Karen continued to act like she was in charge of the situation. She tried to direct the officer where to stand, told him what laws applied, and even suggested he issue me a citation on the spot. She spoke with absolute certainty, as if her role on the HOA board placed her above everyone else. The more she talked, the more holes appeared in her story. Dates didn't line up. Claims contradicted each other. Her supposed authority kept shrinking under simple follow-up questions. The officer asked if there was any criminal activity taking place. Karen hesitated, then said I was refusing lawful orders. When asked whose orders, she replied, the HOA's. That answer changed the tone immediately. The officer explained calmly but firmly that an HOA is not law enforcement and cannot issue lawful orders in the way she was describing. Her face tightened, but she doubled down, insisting that HOA rules were basically the same as law. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Karen expected the officer to side with her automatically. She waited for me to be scolded, threatened, or removed. Instead, she watched control slip through her fingers. The crowd of neighbors grew quieter, sensing that this wasn't going the way she planned. And while Karen was still busy posturing and trying to dominate the situation, she hadn't yet noticed something important, something that was about to change everything once the officer took a closer look at me. The moment the officer finally turned his full attention toward me, something shifted in the air. He had been professional and composed the entire time, but as his eyes met mine, there was a flicker of recognition that Karen completely missed. At first, he simply studied my face a second longer than necessary, as if double-checking a memory. Then his posture softened. Just slightly. He asked me my name. And when I answered, his expression changed in a way that no amount of acting could hide. There was a pause, just a heartbeat, but it felt much longer. Karen was mid-sentence, still ranting about violations and authority, when the officer quietly said my name out loud. His voice wasn't stern. It was familiar. That was when it clicked. This wasn't just any responding officer. He was my son. The realization hit Karen like a brick wall. She stopped talking mid-word. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked from the officer to me and back again, clearly trying to process what she was seeing. The confidence drained from her face so fast it was almost shocking. The woman who had been barking orders minutes earlier suddenly looked small, uncertain, and visibly shaken. The officer addressed me again, this time confirming a few personal details enough to make it undeniable. He maintained professionalism, but the connection was clear. Karen's hands began to tremble. She took a step back, as if physical distance could undo what she'd just learned. The crowd of neighbors picked up on it instantly. Whispers rippled through the sidewalk. Eyes widened. Phones suddenly came out. Karen tried to recover. She stammered something about conflict of interest, accusing the officer of bias before he'd even taken a side. But the damage was already done. Her attempt only made her look more desperate. The officer calmly explained that he would proceed by the book, documenting everything and calling for a supervisor if necessary. His tone was controlled, firm, and no longer tolerant of her interruptions. For the first time since this ordeal began, Karen wasn't in control of the narrative. She could no longer intimidate, interrupt, or overpower the situation with sheer volume. Every claim she had made was now being re-examined carefully. Her false confidence had exposed her own misconduct. She had called the police expecting a weapon. Instead, she had invited accountability. As the officer reviewed the documents I had provided earlier, Karen stood silently, arms crossed tightly, eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. The irony was heavy. She had tried to use authority to crush someone she saw as weaker. Instead, she was now facing the consequences of abusing that authority under the watchful eyes of a community that was finally seeing her for who she really was. Once the reality of the situation fully set in, the atmosphere changed completely. The supervisor arrived shortly after, and with him came a level of seriousness Karen clearly hadn't anticipated. What she thought would be a quick show of force against me turned into a detailed review of her actions. The officers asked her to explain, step by step, why she had called the police. This time, there was no shouting, no interruptions, no dramatic speeches. Every word she spoke was measured against facts, documents, and the statements already on record. Her story began to unravel almost immediately. She couldn't clearly explain what law I had broken. She struggled to justify why a civil HOA disagreement had been reported as a police matter. When asked if she had been warned before about misuse of authority or harassment, she hesitated just long enough to answer the question for herself. The officers took notes. My paperwork was reviewed again, carefully and thoroughly. It confirmed exactly what I had said from the beginning. I was no longer part of the HOA, and I was well within my legal rights. Karen was then informed, calmly but firmly, that filing a false or misleading police report is a serious matter. She was also told that continuing to harass a resident, especially after being formally notified, could expose her and the HOA to legal consequences. The confidence she once carried was completely gone. She nodded quietly, avoiding eye contact, no longer the self-appointed enforcer she had tried to be earlier. Word spread through the neighborhood quickly. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years finally saw that Karen's power wasn't absolute. A few even spoke up, sharing their own experiences of intimidation and unfair treatment. The officers listened. Patterns emerged. What had started as my personal issue was suddenly much bigger. Karen wasn't just exposed. She was isolated. Before leaving, the supervisor made it clear that any further disputes between the HOA and former residents would need to be handled through proper legal channels, not through intimidation or emergency calls. Karen was advised to cease all direct contact with me immediately. That instruction carried weight. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. As the police cars pulled away, the street felt different, lighter somehow. Karen walked off without a word. Her authority shattered in front of the very people she had once controlled through fear. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The decision to leave the HOA had been difficult, but standing up for myself had been worth it. That day didn't just end a conflict. It changed the balance of power in the neighborhood. And for Karen, it marked the moment she learned a lesson she never expected: real authority isn't something you can fake, threaten with, or borrow. It has limits, and when you cross them, the consequences are very real. If you enjoy real stories where abuse of power gets exposed and truth wins, subscribe to the channel. New stories like this are uploaded regularly.